decision. Paula Sheriff is a former Labour MP and told LBC she was sent thousands of violent threats when she was an MP.
Towards the end, death threats were coming in thick and fast. And it was just absolutely awful. That fear that you have of constantly looking over your shoulder, worrying about your family, worrying about your staff, worrying about leaving the office.
Northern Ireland could see its government up and running again by Saturday after changes to post-Brexit trade rules passed through the Commons today. The DUP says that conditions exist for a return to power sharing. And it's been confirmed that Lewis Hamilton will leave Mercedes at the end of the 2024 season and join Ferrari. The 7-time Formula One world champion says it's been one of the hardest decisions. Sports journalist Christian Hugill told LBC News it is significant.
He transcends Formula One. He is a legend, he's an icon, he's the sports figurehead, and he is joining the most famous team in Formula One history. This is one of the most significant sporting moves of all time.
In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed down 8 points at 76.22. The pound buys $1.27 and €1.17. LBC weather, light rain tonight for northwest Scotland and some parts of Northern Ireland, clearer for central and southeast England, and a low of 3 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Daryl Jackson.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Iain Dale.
Very good evening to you. 3 minutes past 8 on LBC. Welcome to the middle hour of our programme. We're streaming it live on Global Play if you'd like to watch, because we're in the company of Kwajo Tweneboa, social housing campaigner. Kwajo, welcome.
Thank you.
You came in a few months ago and did a phone. It was really successful, so we thought we'd have you back because housing, I mean, all aspects of it ought to form a major part of the debate about what the future of the country is for the next election. But and I've always thought that the political party that had some really exciting, interesting, innovative proposals on housing would be in a really good place to win the election. But I'm not seeing it being one of the main election issues. Are you?
No, and my priority is to try and make sure that it is, because housing absolutely should be, and it never is, or when it is, it's always the wrong sorts of things I believe they're focusing on. And I think housing has become so difficult for so many people. It impacts the lives of absolutely everyone. And I don't think it gets the respect it deserves, right? I mean, housing affects other parts of society too. I mean, NHS bosses last week or the week before came out and said you cannot fix the NHS without fixing the issues in relation to housing. I mean, they spend £1.4 billion a year looking after people in poor conditions. And then we've got 139,000 homeless kids up and down the country. How do we expect them to get a good quality level of education? And that's predicted to rise significantly. So housing isn't just a sole issue. It has impacts on other areas of British society and people's lives. And that's why at the election, I think it's got to a point now, it's that breaking point where it has to be a sort of leading political issue for, I think, all parties.
We will be taking your calls to Kwajo in a moment. 0345 6060973 if you'd like to put your questions through him. But for those of you who weren't listening to him last time and don't know, Kwajo, just tell us what you do, because I think I first met you in the Good Morning Britain green room, and you were and I can't remember what you were there to talk about at the time, but I remember thinking, he's just got a really interesting way of talking about these issues that people could relate to, which is why I wanted to have you on the programme. But what do you spend your days, weeks doing?
Yeah, so at the moment I go up and down the country, speaking to people up and down the country, many people living in social housing, but often poor conditions, and that comes through lived experience. I live in social housing, have lived in social housing, and I've experienced disrepair for years, and my dad became ill. He passed away in January 2020, but was living prior to his death in absolute slum conditions. Cockroaches, mice, damp, mould. District nurses coming in 3 times a day to feed him through his stomach. And it was just absolutely appalling. What I learned after that and travelling around the country, that there's so many more people than people like you would believe living in similar conditions, even worse conditions, and have been in many cases for absolute years.
And I think, let's take the bad conditions first of all, because there's so many different subjects we can talk about. You have public sector landlords, local councils, housing associations, and then you have private sector landlords. In your experience, which are the easiest to persuade to take their responsibilities really seriously. So, for example, if you've got a damp problem and nobody's doing anything to get it fixed, who takes their responsibility seriously, or is it difficult to generalise?
It's difficult to generalise. I mean, they often the only reason tenants come to me, let me make it clear, is because they're not getting help elsewhere, and they are so desperate. Their mental health has been impacted, and they sort of know this is what I do, and often I do get sort of solutions and answers, but only because I've been doing this and shaming landlords and providers for years. But in the case of who acts first and who does what they're supposed to first, all the cases that come to me because the landlords simply haven't done that. But also the state of disrepair and poor conditions in the private rented sector is equally as bad. I think 1 in 4 homes in social housing don't make the decent home standard, and it's similar in the private rented accommodation too.
A friend of mine, who I better not name, he had a problem with rats in the attic, and then found out that there was damp all around the walls, and mould had developed, and 2 young children, and this is like in a bungalow in Surrey. Now, his landlord actually was really good and tried to sort it out, but it was clearly so serious that it couldn't be sorted out initially. So instead of keeping my friend to his lease, he just said, well, you cannot live in my property. You just can't.
Yeah.
I mean, in a good way, not sort of ordering him to go, but actually being quite helpful in the whole process. But I suspect the people that come to see you have landlords that don't take that for you.
No, and I mean, that for me is an absolute rare example, but an absolute good example of someone being responsible, right, and prioritising the health and safety of tenants. And far too often, that's something that doesn't happen, especially in social housing. There's a complete disregard for health and safety. You'd think that they don't really have a duty of care when in fact they do. There's been many occasions where residents, often actually residents that I come across, have doctors and nurses and GPs, head teachers writing in to these providers, and their letters are simply just ignored. Barely, it's probably in many cases not even acknowledged, and that shows, I think, just how much these providers prioritise, I think, the duty of care for their tenants. But of course, that's not me saying every single landlord and private landlord across. It would be wrong for me to do that. Is like that.
You just think, from a human point of view, if you work for one of, whether it's a private sector landlord or a social housing provider, and you're getting these letters in and you just ignore them, I mean, what kind of job satisfaction, what kind of human being are you if you see people in distress and just do nothing to help them?
I mean, their argument perhaps would be the fact that we don't have enough social housing and we don't have anywhere to move them, but still there's many cases where it's just complete ignorance and a failure to uphold a duty of care for their tenants, and laziness, quite frankly, and it often puts people's lives at risk. What upsets me the most is we're 7 years on from Grenfell, right, and the residents in Grenfell, many of them complained about similar things that residents complain to be about now, and it's 7 years on, and it comes with health and safety too, but still there isn't that priority to prioritise and take seriously the health and safety, put it first and foremost before cutting costs, and it's a real shame. I think it's the biggest shame that we're currently facing.
Now, in 2009, Gordon Brown made a party conference speech, and the headline from it was "British Jobs for British Workers."
He did.
Now, we've got a variation on that now from the Conservatives. So in what the Independent is calling a controversial new Tory housing policy, they're seeking to overhaul the housing system, and they're promising British homes for British people. Now, under the new plans, the government is pledging priority housing for people with close connections to the UK and their local area. Applicants who can demonstrate a connection to the UK for at least 10 years and their local area for at least 2 years will be favoured. What's wrong with that?
Well, I mean, this British Homes for British Workers, for me, as soon as I heard it, it was almost, I rolled my eyes when I saw it. And the reason I rolled my eyes was because what it was saying to me was that non-UK nationals are being prioritised for social housing, almost stealing from the plates of UK nationals, when that for me is factually incorrect. And the government knew what they were doing with this slogan.
But there is a perception of that, isn't there?
There is.
That sort of British people who've been on the housing ladder for 4 years or 10 years or whatever, aren't getting properties when people who come to this country as asylum seekers or whatever automatically walk into a property.
Yeah,
That's
there is.
the perception.
And that is the perception. It's factually incorrect, but the government know that is the perception. And by putting this slogan out, what they're going to hope and what many people will think is, why should UK nationals not be prioritised about before those coming into the country? The facts are 81% of new social housing goes to white British nationals. 90% of social housing goes to UK nationals already. For me, the slogan just suggests that foreigners are being prioritised over UK nationals when this simply isn't the case. And actually, the Oxford Migration Observatory found migrants are more likely to live in poor quality private rented homes than UK nationals. The problem isn't migrants or foreigners here. The problem is the lack of access to social housing. That isn't the problem of people coming to the UK. That isn't the problem of foreigners. It's generations of underinvestment by consecutive governments, Labour and the Conservatives. And it started for me with the Right to Buy scheme when it was introduced under Margaret Thatcher. I think it's one of the worst policies. I'd even go as far to say the worst policy that any government has introduced in this country in relation to housing. And people on the surface thought it was absolutely great, right? Over 2 million homes were bought under the Right to Buy scheme. Working class individuals got to buy their own homes. But at what expense? We've now got 1.4 million people on the current social housing waiting list. No governments have met their housing targets. There was a promise under the Right to Buy scheme that they were going to replace the homes that they sold off. That never happened. We've got 139,000 homeless kids. The homes that we do have, 1 in 4 don't meet the current decent home standard. And I'd even go further than that. A lot of people won't know, right, that Charlie Goh, who's the son of, I want to get this right, Iain Goh, he was the housing minister under Margaret Thatcher when the Right to Buy... Gow. Yes, Gow. When they introduced the Right to Buy scheme. In 2013, it was found that he owned 40 or more ex-council properties on a single estate in South London. If that is a successful Right to Buy scheme, then I don't know, perhaps I'm arguing on the wrong subject, but these are the reasons why we currently have a social housing.
But why is it that, as you say, successive governments, not just Conservative ones, have not replenished the council houses that were sold under Right to Buy? Because, I mean, Labour had the opportunity to do that when they came in 1997, but they actually embraced the Right to Buy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that was the failure. I think what they thought it was, and what I'm currently understanding, is the Right to Buy scheme, right, was a really popular policy. And I believe it still is a popular policy because people see it on the surface for what it is rather than what it's actually caused and what it means, right? I mean, Lee Rowley came out.
He's a housing minister.
Yes, he's a housing minister. He came out a few days ago and he said in an interview that 700,000 social homes were built in the last 14 years. But government statistics show that between 2010 and 2022, there was a net loss of 120,000 social homes. 161,553 social homes were built in that time frame. We sold 210,396 and knocked down 71,541. And in between 2022 and 2023, there was a net loss of 6,635 social homes when we've got 1.4 million people on a social housing waiting list, and that number is growing. Now, look, I only got a C at maths GCSE.
Me too.
And do you know what? I'm proud of it. But even I can tell those numbers don't match. If they're talking about tackling the housing crisis, how are we demolishing and selling off through the Right to Buy scheme more social homes than we're actually building in a year, and then talking about, well, it's a popular policy and it's worked and we need to continue it, whilst in the same breath talking about fixing and solving the housing crisis? It makes no sense whatsoever. And I've spoken to the Conservative Party, I've spoken to Labour too, about Labour ministers and Conservative ministers about this issue with Right to Buy. And I think it absolutely needs to be changed at the very least to make sure social homes aren't being sold off, or it needs to be completely scrapped. But it's a popular policy and therefore they won't do that, I don't believe.
Well, no, I don't think they will either, because if you put that in your manifesto, it doesn't matter which party you are, there'll be quite a large group in society who would think that's outrageous. But I mean, it's a simple solution. If you're selling off 1,000 houses, we'll build another 1,000 or build another 2,000. But of course, there are so many obstructions to new house building in this country at the moment that it's almost impossible to do. We've covered a couple of issues. There's so much more that we can cover, but we're going to go to calls in a moment. 0345 6060 973 if you'd like to put a question or a comment, indeed, to Kwajo Tweneboa. It is 17 minutes past 8 on LBC.
This is LBC.
Social housing campaigner Kwajo Tweneboa is with me in the studio. We're about to take your calls. Andy in Bishop Stortford has sent in this text. He says, Ian, this argument that we would have more homes available if council stock hadn't been sold is just pure nonsense. There are still the same number of houses in existence. So what if someone owns 40 ex-council properties? He's presumably housing people in them that would otherwise need to find accommodation elsewhere. That's a fair point, isn't it?
Well, he's housing them in 40 ex-council homes, right? That would have been social housing. And I'm pretty sure it's going to be for a lot more than what it would be had it been still or remained social housing. And not only that, we have to talk about population size and population and the future too, if we just stopped building homes.
But isn't that actually at the root of this? That if we had still got the same population as we had in 1979, that argument that Andy's deployed there, I think, would be quite a good one. But the population has gone up. I don't know what the population was in 1979, but it's probably, 58, 60 million. It's now 68, 70 million, due to go up to 74 million in the next few years. And yet, governmental authorities, whether it's national government or local government, have not invested in the housing stock to enable us to cope with that number of people.
Yeah,
And that I think is far more at the root of the problem than selling off council houses.
And we could have predicted that population size would
Yeah.
grow, but at the moment, currently, we have less social housing now than we did in the 1980s, right? And even with the right to buy scheme, you would have expected that it would be an incentive for governments to go that extra mile to build more homes at a faster rate, but that simply hasn't happened.
Well, I can remember in the 1980s, when this first came in 1979, inflation was a big problem, and it was also at the end of the 1980s. And I think they restricted councils to only being allowed to invest 25% of the receipts into new houses, because they said, well, if we reinvest everything back into it, then that will cause more inflation. And I mean, there is an economic argument that would say that would be true. But we've had quite a few years since then when, inflation is a problem now, but most of your adult life, it hasn't been. And you think, well, surely when interest rates were low, that's the time to borrow money to build new houses, and when it wouldn't cause inflation. But they didn't do it.
No, and we would never, practically speaking, we wouldn't, even if they were, right, and they were to do that, we wouldn't be able to build homes and construct homes at the speed at which we're selling them off. So there's always going to be a sort of problem there and an issue with numbers, right, and people and the demand and supply, because we're not able to physically construct homes at the speed at which we're allowing them to be sold off. Yeah. Right.
Lucy in Mitcham is a fan. Kwajo speaks so much sense. He's campaigned for our local area and is so passionate and knowledgeable. I hope politicians from all parties listen to him, as good housing is a basic right. When you're meeting with politicians, do you feel that they are sort of going through the motions, that they sort of, let's pat Kwajo on the head and he'll go away and say nice things about us? Or do you think they really listen to what you're saying and they take it in? And have you seen anything that you've said to them that they actually have done something about?
Yeah, I have. I have to be honest. I have to be fair, because I'm the only ones really in those meetings, and I think it's only fair for me to be transparent. There have been situations where I've gone into meetings and just thought, that it's just gone in one ear and out the other. But there's also been situations like I've mentioned after I started going on social media, posting the conditions people are living in. Michael Gove called me in and he asked for advice on obviously the social housing regulation bill, what I would do, and some of that was implemented into the regulation. So in that sense, part of it was listened to. I would have wished that all of it was. But also I've had meetings with Sadiq Khan, I've had meetings with Angela Rayner, and having conversations, they get what it is that I'm saying. They understand what it is that I'm saying. I've explained the situation with Right to Buy, but at the end of the day, they're the ones in government, right? And they want to win the next election, and they're going to do that through popular policies. And that's why, although I might be speaking sense and hearing things at a grassroots level that perhaps they're not, I don't know if everything that I'm saying is a priority to either party, but I think they underestimate just how much people are struggling with housing in the rented sector and how much change they want. Yet, for example, we're talking about home ownership when people can't even pay their rent at the end of the month.
Right, shall we go to a call? Let's go to Kevin in Basingstoke. Kevin, hello.
Hiya.
What would you like to say?
Renting a ex-council house would be far more expensive than renting it from the council, but that wasn't my point. What I was going to say is after the Second World War, we built 1 million new homes and brought in the NHS in 5 years. And also, if the council, if Margaret Thatcher didn't sell off council houses, I would never have met my ex-partner and had my 2 great kids. She bought an ex-council house next time.
So Margaret Thatcher did something good for you. Well, that's a delight to hear. Kwajo, what about the main point that Kevin's making? I mean, if we could build 1 million houses in the years after the Second World War, why can't we do it now?
Well, that's listen. You've been asking the exact same question I've been asking politicians too, but I think it's political will that's there, right? And political will was there after the Second World War. If we could do that after the Second World War, we're now in 2024. Why can't they do it now? And I know, obviously, they're going to say there's no money there, but I definitely think there's ways which they can sort of accumulate money to invest in housing, but again, and social housing and building social housing, because that is, I think, the foundations, right? If we're going to fix this housing crisis, we do it from the bottom and work our way up, and it starts with social housing, because that's what everyone else is going to depend on when all things go wrong. But it comes back to political will. For them, is that the priority, or is for the priority the Conservative government stop the boats, or is the priority for Labour something else, right? And I think if a political party is really going to change this country in the way that we need it to, they need to focus on housing. I believe I mentioned earlier the impact it has on the NHS and education and other areas of society. If you're really going to turn things around, even mental health for people, if you're really going to turn things out, you would do what is needed for social housing and housing in general, and focus on that. And I think it would help improve other areas of society too.
Shona in Edinburgh says there are a huge number of right-to-buy properties which are now in the hands of private landlords. It's fragmented the estates of social landlords and taken security away from families. Paul says, I work in maintenance and I can assure you that local authorities do not want council properties. They try to hive off estates to housing corporations. I mean, that is true, isn't it? Because I don't know what proportion of local authorities still have sort of in-house council housing, but a lot of them have been hived off into effectively, I mean, they're public sector, but housing associations, but sort of one step removed.
Yeah, and they will argue the point that they are underfunded, and that's the reason that they do that and pass it on to housing associations. The quality isn't really any better under housing associations, and yes, it's still considered social housing, but also we have to discuss, like, even in temporary accommodation, the amount that we're paying to private landlords to house those that are homeless. And why is that? It's because we need to, but also the amount going to hotels and sort of Airbnbs to house people in, because we don't have enough social homes. It's predicted that this year we will spend £2 billion, or councils will spend £2 billion on temporary accommodation. That includes paying to private landlords, that includes hotels and Airbnbs, those sorts of accommodations. When in fact, if we had just consistently invested in social housing, I think it's actually in fact going to cost us more what has happened with the state of social housing than if we had consistently invested in social housing and made sure that we kept our stock. It's social housing for a reason. It's like the NHS. I don't believe it should be privatised. It was set up in the way that it was for a reason, and I think we need to appreciate why we set up these sorts of institutions and social housing, and we have to keep it the way in which it is, or the way in which it was, and that should be our aim. We need to go back to that.
I'm not sure I agree with that, because I agree with you. The NHS was set up for a reason. But you can't say that the NHS of 2024 should be the same as the NHS from 1948.
No,
it
should,
can't be.
No. I didn't mean it in that sense. Of course it has to change. I mean, time changes. I wouldn't agree that the standards now should have been the same back in 1945. But what I mean is that, like, for example, people should have access to it at the point at which they need it, and it should be of a decent quality, and we should appreciate it. Remember, when social housing was first introduced, people were proud to live in social housing. People wanted to live in social housing. Social housing had a good reputation, and that's been completely decimated over the years. I remember under the coalition government, in fact, even the word social housing was sort of it was left a sour taste in the mouths of politicians, and that for me said a lot.
Okay. Right, I was just about to go to another call, then I realised what the time was. It's 8:30. It's time for the news with Daryl Jackson.
The Home Secretary says last night's chemical attack in Clapham was appalling. A woman and her youngest daughter have possibly life-changing injuries, while her elder daughter is also in hospital. Another 2 people have been charged with the murders of teenagers Mason Wrist and Max Dixon in Bristol on Saturday. A boy aged 15 and a 16-year-old will appear at the city's youth court tomorrow. And Lewis Hamilton's confirmed he will leave Mercedes at the end of the 2024 season. The 7-time Formula One world champion is joining Ferrari and says he's looking forward to a new challenge. LBC weather: light rain tonight for northwest Scotland and some parts of Northern Ireland. Clear for central and southeast England and a low of 3 degrees.
This is LBC.
3, Kwajo Tweneboa is with me, a social housing campaign, and we've got so many calls coming into the programme. We'll come back to them in a second, but I do want to go to this text from Rupert, who says, I've been a town planner for almost 15 years, working for most of that time in London. The biggest problem for social housing and housing in general is it's simply a numbers game. Not enough is being built, and the biggest problem, I hate to say it, is Joe Public, who object to anything in their area from being built. Doesn't matter if it's a Tory or a Labour-held local authority, it's all the same. Local councillors will put their voters first over any need for housing. Nothing will change whilst housing is still determined at the local level. The problem is, Kwajo, how can you not do it at a local level? You can't have the man from Whitehall determining sort of where a housing estate should go, can you? Or woman from Whitehall.
Yeah, I get that point, but I think we have a huge problem in this country with NIMBYism, and a few years ago I didn't even know what that term meant. I've sort of learned on the job. And it is becoming a huge sort of barrier block to actually building more homes in this country. I think we have to realise as a country, we are almost, I'd say we're in dire straits at the moment. We've got, like I mentioned, 1.4 million people waiting to get into social homes. Renting prices, private rented prices through the absolute roof. We need homes for the growing population, and we need places to build them. But if everyone's turning around and saying, no, we don't want it in our not in our backyard sort of thing, it's going to be an eyesore, it's going to destroy our towns, it's going to destroy our cities, then we're never going to make progress. There has to be, I think, a balance. And I think government are going to have to get to a point where they put their foot down and say, look, we need more homes, because ultimately there's people going homeless. There are people without a roof over their head.
Well, the village I grew up in, the school roll in the primary school that I went to, when I was there, was 105. It's now under 60. Now, that school is going to close soon unless new young families move into the village. But the parish council doesn't want any new houses at all for exactly the reasons that Rupert has said. And, I mean, I think that's just a crying shame, because whether you live in a small village in a rural area or whether you live in a city, your local area needs to be constantly revived, if that's the right word. And you only do that by new people coming in from time to time. And it's just not happening in so many places up and down the country.
I think people worry that when they talk about building homes, right, in their towns and in their cities, bulldozers are just going to roll through and destroy the way their towns and cities looks, when that's not the case. I mean, homes can be built and integrated into towns and cities to look like they were always there, sort of thing. And that's, I think, what we have to, the way in which we have to do it. But the ultimate, I think the bottom line for me, right, is who am I going to, and I might sound harsh saying this, but who am I really going to listen to and prioritise? Someone that's homeless and doesn't have a roof over their head and the need to have a roof over their head, or someone that doesn't want a home built because they think it's going to be an eyesore. I know who I'm going to prioritise, and I think that's the route we're going to have to start going down.
Stephen's emailed to say, listening to Kwajo's passion for housing and helping people, I predict he'll get an MBE in the future. I would have thought a CBE at the very least.
I did get nominated last year, but I turned it down.
Oh, no, you didn't.
I did.
Did you?
I did, yeah. I did, and I made the reasons clear as to why. I mean, the reason I shouldn't be having to do this, right? I shouldn't be having to do this campaigning work, and as a result, so many people are suffering. This shouldn't be my job. And the reason I turned it down was I wasn't taking an award while this existing situation was going on, whilst people continue to die in poor conditions in their homes, whilst people continue to be homeless, whilst 1.4 million people are on the current social housing waiting list. I didn't come into this for that. The reason I came into this was to get government to change and really genuinely change things for the people of this country. That's the only goal there. That's the only thing that I care about. And that's the only sort of reward that I want. So, yeah.
Maybe in the future.
Who knows?
Right, let's go to Jessica, who's a new caller in Oxford. Hi, Jessica.
Good evening.
What would you like to say?
So I just wanted to ask about the sort of environmental standpoint that you think would be best sort of used in sort of building new sort of social housing. I mean, I definitely agree that more is needed, but with the sort of building on floodplains and the increased sort of flooding risk and sort of all the risks to the environment that we know are coming up, I mean, in terms of protecting those green spaces, how we're going to do that. And in the case of these properties, these social houses that, aren't up to standard, what's the best option? To sort of knock them down, rebuild better houses? And in that sort of sense, where would people then go? They'd be displaced. I mean, I actually really agree with everything that's being said. My sort of curiosity is just more from an environmental point of view.
Yeah, and I said the environment is it's a priority and absolutely has to be a priority, and there has to be a fine balance. I think that's why people have suggested, in terms of homes in poor conditions, there are estates that simply have to be knocked down, like my own estate, which is just, we've got mice in our walls and everything. It's just completely past its sort of age and has to be knocked down and rebuilt. But there are estates which can be retrofitted, and they can go into homes and they can just retrofit their insides, as opposed to having to demolish actual estates. And then in terms of prioritise it or protecting green space, again, that is another fine balance that we have to make, because this climate crisis isn't getting any better. But also we have to take into consideration with climate change those situations last year where I was having people, I believe it was last year, when we had during the summer 40 degrees, or was it the year before, 40 degrees heat, and I was having people in tower blocks, right, old tower blocks, messaging me, telling me how excruciatingly hot their homes were, the fact that they were boiling in their homes. So not only are homes cold during winter, during the summer they're absolutely boiling, and we have to be building homes that are sort of in a eco-friendly way as possible, but also efficient.
And they don't have to be, I guess they probably would be a bit more expensive than your bog standard house, but they don't have to be massively expensive. And there are also these, I hate to call them kit houses, but that's essentially what they are, which to me, in Germany, that's where the house building boom was in the 70s and 80s in Germany, not building sort of normal brick houses. And they're not prefabs, because that word also conjures up sort of post-war temporary accommodation. They are built to last. But they're actually quite luxurious in many ways, and they cost a lot less than building a normal brick house. I don't know why we aren't doing that more.
It doesn't have to cost a lot more, and for the government, they should look at it as an investment. If we're building homes, right, that is saving people in terms of their gas and fuel, saving them so much more. Or, for example, like you mentioned, in Germany, they have these types of homes that are nice.
Hofhäuser, they're called.
Oh, are they?
Yes.
And they're nice inside, but why shouldn't we be building nice homes? Why does social housing have to look different to other forms of housing? I think it should all be integrated, regardless of whatever town or city is. And I think that would hopefully try and remove this whole idea of NIMBYism too. But who knows?
Right, let's go to Jessica. Thank you for that. Let's go to Jane in Westminster. Jane, what would you like to ask Kwajo?
Hello, good evening to both of you. My mind is going to, I listen to LBC, and I've heard of the veterans who have to sleep in their cars at the moment, unfortunately. Various guys ring you up, and it's so sad. Now then, prefabs. I'm 80 now, but it's going so fast. Anyway, in the 50s, in the East End of London, they did build prefabs. Obviously, the housing and the way they were built is different from what I should think they could do today. And this is what I'm ringing in. Why can't they build a few prefabs for these guys, not let them go into hostels, etc.? So that's what I'm ringing about. I know there's a shortage of housing. It's a terrible situation. I do live in social housing myself. I won't go into my problems. However, I've just had a think about prefab housing, low cost bungalow type. Enough for a single person.
Yeah, and there are different forms of it. And all I'm saying is that because when I lived in Germany, and admittedly this was a long time ago, but they are actually brilliant places to live. And yet, in this country, it just hasn't caught on at all. I think it's a missed opportunity. Thank you, Jane. Let's take a text from Martin in Sussex. I live in social housing and it's really helped me in my recovery from a mental breakdown. I'm 53 and lived in social housing when I was a kid until my parents bought the house in the 80s. Since then, I feel society as a whole now has an attitude that if you buy your own home, you've succeeded, but if you live in social housing, you've failed at life. There is a bit of that, isn't there?
Oh, absolutely. I think that is in some ways at the heart of stigma behind social housing, and social housing has had a bad stigma for a very long time. I always talk about shows that were on TV like Benefit Street or How to Get a Council Home and the sort of negative connotations that come along with that. But social housing honestly changes people's lives. But again, it's this whole idea of home ownership that is pushed by the government, and we're made to believe, right, that owning your own home is the ultimate form of success and defining one's success, and it provides you with affordability, stability, when in fact what we've seen over the last year, especially after Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng, and mortgage prices going up, we are shown that that's not necessarily the case. And what people, I think we need to move away from that or government needs to move away from that and realise that having shelter and having access to housing is a human right. It's a necessity for us all. It isn't just an asset. It isn't just a luxury. It isn't just a definition of one's wealth. It's a home for people, and that's what social housing was for many people.
But what about people who earn a lot of money but are still in social housing? I mean, there's a Labour MP, Absalma Begum, I think her name is, where she has openly said, and I thought, well, you're not going to win many votes by doing this, saying, I don't really need to, but I quite like it. And I'm thinking, well, I mean, Bob Crow, the former leader of the RMT, I think he was on $130,000 a year and was still living in social housing. You think, well, they're actually depriving of somebody who needs a house at home.
Well, again, I don't think those are the people that, and I've thought about this, I don't think that those are the people that should be blamed. In regards to Apsana, there was a lot of outrage around that, and no doubt her parents would have lived in social housing, and then she's living in social housing. We don't know what the circumstances around that is, but someone made a very valid point, and that was the fact that yes, she is currently living in social housing, but then in regards to MPs, right, and their second homes, who is it that's paying for those second homes?
I'm not quite sure I see the analogy.
So the point I'm making is we're talking about Apsana earning X amount of money and she's living in social housing currently, but the taxpayers also paying towards the homes of other MPs too.
Yeah, well, that's because they have to have them to do their job. If you live in Liverpool, you can't go home after voting at 10 o'clock every night. So,
But I think it was with that analogy, without that analogy, there was almost this demonisation of Apsana being in social housing or continuing to live in social housing as an MP. But I was thinking...
But somebody suggested that if you earn over a certain amount, you should be given sort of a year's notice or something and free up that house. Because I was watching my local news in Kent the other night, and there were two brothers who were being evicted from their house that they'd lived in for 50 years because the tenancy had passed from their father to their mother, and apparently under the rules you can't then pass it to the son. So they've been evicted from their home of 50 years. That's outrageous.
Yeah, and I do see that all the time, but that comes back down to tenancy and tenancy rights, and a lot of new tenancies, especially with housing associations. I had it. I was nearly evicted from my home because after...
I'd like to see them try and evict you.
I know. Well, it was during the pandemic. After my dad passed away, they asked us to send in his death certificate, basically, and then said, basically, they're sorry that he's passed away. Here is your eviction notice too. But because it was the pandemic, we argued that point, and we looked in his contract, and in his contract it said that a spouse could succeed the tenancy, but his kids couldn't. And I've learned since then that there's many kids up and down the country that lose a parent and then get evicted from their social home, which to me doesn't make sense because they're going to end up back at the back of the queue, at the back of the waiting list, and it just causes them more misery. But that is a massive issue that I want to change, and I want government to change, is succession rights, especially for kids when parents pass away.
Yeah. Well, it was reported this week that Michael Gove is considering a household salary cap over which you're not eligible for social housing, but they haven't decided what the cap might be. More of your calls in a moment. It's 8:48.
LBC
9. So many calls coming in. We could do this for the next 3 hours, Kwajo, but I guess you have a life. Right, let's go to John in Brighton. Hello, John.
Hello, Ian, and hello, Ojo. You're doing a great job.
Thank you.
Yeah?
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah. So my question is about some councils want to bring in licensing schemes for private landlords like Brighton, which sounds great. So that will involve licensing the landlords and inspecting the properties. The problem with it is that landlords can just pass on the costs of the licensing to the tenants in higher rents, and it also just gives more power to landlords over tenants in the end. So what do you think about these private licensing schemes? I mean, I guess you've heard of them in places.
Yeah, so you're referring to the licensing schemes that were going to be introduced by councils to make sure landlords were keeping the properties up to a livable standard for tenants.
So they want to do that in Brighton.
Yeah.
So that will involve licensing landlords, meeting certain conditions, and also inspecting the properties to meet certain conditions.
How much would the landlords have to pay to get a licence?
It's a few quid. I mean, it's hundreds of pounds. I mean, I think it's about £500 or £700.
What, per landlord or per property?
Maybe a 5-year period, I think, or something like that.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, it's not a huge amount. I remember talking about this a few months ago. It was a while back now, and I believe statistics showed that in London areas it had been proven to be successful. My only worry with this licensing scheme again was costs then being passed on to tenants, but also in regards to the people actually regulating these. So it's put down on the local authority to regulate these landlords, but then we know what some local authorities' homes are like, and it's a bit like calling pot kettle black. But also funding. How are they supposed to do it? They can barely do what they're doing at the moment without additional funding. So these are the conversations and worries that I have around the licensing scheme, but I absolutely believe that there has to be something there to ensure that landlords aren't getting away, whilst charging rent, they aren't getting away with allowing their tenants and residents to live in slum conditions.
Right, thank you for that, John. Let's go on to Rienzi in King's Cross. Good evening, what would you like to say?
Oh, hi. Yeah, no, I just thought I'd call up that planner that called up earlier on. It just doesn't fit right with what we went through in King's Cross or Somers Town. It posed many applications to build here, and all got refused. And NIMBYism, I don't know. We wanted social housing, we wanted more flats, but all we've got is some high-rise, big high-rise flats that are just sold off to people who don't even live in the country, and they're all going for £1 million. And it's just. It's really infuriating for us. Also, this leaseholder stuff as well. All you've got is people who buy up 4 or 5 properties in this council flat. I don't feel I live in the community anymore. It's a real shame. They just don't live here anymore, and it's a shame. I grew up in the 1970s. When you moved into a council flat, you got a new council flat within a week. Now you have to wait 10 years. So I just.
Okay, thank you very much indeed for that. What about this thing about foreign buyers buying up properties in London and then they just keep them empty? I thought the government had done something about that.
Well, I know Rachel Reeves has mentioned if Labour are to get in, that they're going to do something about it. And I know it's a huge issue that Sadiq Khan has spoken about in London, but there are cases like that. Predominantly, as I'm aware, in London, where developments are built. A lot of them are sold to foreign buyers. Many of the homes sit empty, or they just sit on it waiting for property prices to increase before they sell or do whatever they want with it. And I think it's completely wrong during a housing crisis. Yeah. I had a conversation with Angela Rayner, and in fact, I said, if that's going to be allowed, then I think every single foreign buyer should be taxed additionally on top of that on top of those properties, and that money can be used for building more social homes.
I think they already have done that, haven't they? If you're a foreign buyer, I think you're paying sort of X% more of stamp duty. sure they introduced that in a budget recently, but I may be wrong.
I must have missed that, but I definitely had a conversation, and it was around the time of the Labour conference with Angela Rayner about that, and it was mentioned that Rachel Reeves was going to introduce something to counteract that.
Right, let's go to Joe in Northampton. Hi, Joe.
Hi, both. Happy evening. How are you?
Good, thank you. What would you like to say?
Just a very quick one. At what point should people who are renting socially housing should come out of them, if at all? It's an open-ended question, just from a point of view that obviously, if everyone has social housing within the UK and doesn't give up their social housing, we then stagnate, depending on how it doesn't matter how many houses we build. People will always gravitate towards them because they are cheaper to run and occupy, as you've just said about some of the MPs, etc. So therefore, then you could cause an issue later on down the line where cost of living goes up, so everyone goes for affordable sort of housing and social housing. So it's a never-ending cycle that you need to then build more. And then people don't actually own a house, and then we go down the whole rental market, and it's all social. So where's the end point in all of this if we are to keep building more and give social housing more and more each and every year across the UK?
That's a very interesting question. I mean, for me, I believe when social housing was introduced, it was supposed to be a home for life. And that is something that I absolutely do believe in. I completely understand what it is that you're saying, and these conversations have been happening on social media, and one question was raised that if we start saying that to social housing tenants and we start saying, well, if you earn X amount of money, you need to get out of social housing, and we know the state of the private rented sector at the moment, no one, I don't think, likes privately renting at the moment. Well, I'd say the vast majority. But if we start saying to social housing tenants, right, if you earn over a certain amount, then you have to leave and you have to go into the private sector, I think it's gonna what are you giving those in social housing, working class people to aspire to? Why shouldn't they be able to?
Well, and also it comes back to what Joe was saying about community, doesn't it? Because if you can't form a community which is made up of people who own homes as opposed to just houses, then, well, I mean, that's not good for society in general. Joe, thank you very much. I want to finish off with Chloe, who Chris tells me is a very good caller. So don't let me down, Chloe, because we haven't got much time left.
Hi there.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. Thank you for having me on. I sort of just pulled over in an emergency to call you. So I've heard the gentleman that's on tonight, and I'm really sort of eager to ask him a question, really. So ironically, I work in property. I've worked for sort of what you call 5-star developers for a number of years. And I've also been homeless with twin daughters for a number of years also. So this is now the 10th time we've been homeless in about 11 years. My twins are 11, and I'm sort of at the moment going through a battle with my local council, which is Waltham Forest, which I've heard is one of the worst. And
hasn't changed then. I lived there 30 years ago and it was terrible in those days too.
Really? Oh gosh, yeah. So we've actually been moved to 3 different emergency accommodations after about a month or so of trying to prove that we were actually homeless, which we were. And since moving, we've been in really awful situations where we don't have self-contained accommodation, sort of threatened with, I was nearly attacked the other day where we were placed. And it's becoming really destabilising for my kids, considering they are in their last year of primary school doing their SATs. Anywho, I sort of wanted to ask, with the local housing allowance, because I know that the rules around that has changed for quite a while now, what I've been told by my council is essentially they don't have any properties to offer me. And even though I've been given a main duty, which is a duty to help me and my children a bit more than as if we were just claiming that we were homeless, essentially, they've said that because they don't have any properties to offer us, that essentially we can't take any legal action or recourse. Now, because I am a single parent, I don't actually earn enough to private rent anymore by myself. And that is purely because rents have gone up by so much. So it's left me in a sort of catch-22 where I can't rent privately even though I work full-time. But I can't sort of live further out of London, which I've said I'm willing to do. I'm willing to change my whole life, really. And that is because there's no properties that I can afford on my particular wage by myself. So my only option really is council housing. But they've sort of said to me, well, we can't give you a self-contained place or even the emergency accommodation in hotels that we've placed you in is good enough, really, because you're not on the street. But the mental implications and obviously the implications it's having on me and my children, just being able to get to work and do normal daily activities, it's really hard to sort of.
So, Chloe, we're going way over our time. I've gone past the news, but what's your question to Kwajo?
So my question is, with the local housing allowance changing and the rules changing around that, is there any sort of legal action that I can take, considering councils don't have these properties to give out anymore?
It's really difficult, and I mean, this is the conversation around local housing allowance, and I absolutely believe it needs to increase because of the prices to privately rent. It just becomes impossible. There's loads of people in situations like Chloe at the moment who are stuck between who can't privately rent but also can't get access to social housing. I haven't heard of any cases of individuals, I haven't looked into it enough, taking legal action in circumstances like this, but I definitely know that there's many people who find themselves in temporary accommodation for 10 years, which is so sad because their 2 kids for their whole life would have been homeless or in temporary accommodation for 10 years plus, because simply we don't have enough of those social homes. I would say, I don't know how possible it is, but for Chloe, maybe discussing a managed transfer or a move. Like, I know she mentioned moving outside London, but keep on to them about that, because there will be homes that become available. But the fact you've mentioned for 10 years you've been homeless, it'll be interesting to know what band you're into and prioritise within your council. But I mean, that's the state of social housing at the moment.
Chloe, good luck. Thank you very much
Good
indeed
luck.
for calling in. Thanks to everyone who's called in the last hour. As I say, we could have gone on for a lot longer. We've gone 3 minutes past the top of the hour, which is unforgivable in radio. So I'll probably be sacked and won't be here on Monday. But there we go. It's all your fault, Kwajo.
I'll take the blame.
Thank you very much indeed for joining us. We'll have you back very, very soon.
Thank you.
Now, coming up in the next hour, the Archbishop of Canterbury has criticised society's his words, absolutely appalling attitude to forgiveness in an apparent reference to cancel culture. Justin Welby said people ended up paying for the rest of their lives for stupid posts on social media from their younger years, in a speech during which he also hinted at his own experiences of being trolled online. And this in a sense links back to our first hour, doesn't it? So let's talk about forgiveness. Are you a forgiving person? Have you forgotten how to forgive? When was the last time you forgave someone? I'm going to give you an example of me forgiving someone very soon. And it's not forgiving Kwajo for making me run out of time.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, the Home Secretary says a chemical attack on a mother and her 2 children in South London last night is appalling. Officers have named suspect 35-year-old Abdul Aziz, who they say is dangerous and should not be approached. Well, LBC's Charlotte Lynch has been at the scene and says police have released a new image of him.
This image of Abdul Azedi, the suspect in this case, shows him in North London in a Tesco store in Caledonian Road at around 8:45, so just over an hour after the attack in Clapham. And it shows him with a horrific injury on the right-hand side of his face, what looks like a massive burn that he is thought to have sustained in the attack.
A 15 and 16-year-old have been charged with the murders of 2 teenagers in Bristol. Mason Rist and Max Dixon were attacked in Knowle West last Saturday. A 44-year-old man was earlier remanded in custody accused of murder. The US is understood to have approved plans for a multi-day strikes on Iranian targets in Iraq and Syria. Washington says it will retaliate after a drone attack on a military base in Jordan. The DUP has agreed to return to power sharing at Stormont. Following changes to the post-Brexit trading, new rules have cleared the House of Commons today. Lewis Hamilton's confirmed he will leave Mercedes at the end of the 2024 season. The 7-time Formula One world champion is joining Ferrari and says he's looking forward to a new challenge. Jenson Button was Hamilton's teammate at McLaren between 2010 and 2012.
12 years at Mercedes is longer than most people ever spend in Formula One. We all get to that point in our career. It's like, you know what? I've done what I set out to achieve, and you choose to retire. Whereas he's gone the other route and gone, you know what? I feel like I need a change. I'm going to get a Ferrari.
And the Bank of England has signalled fresh hope for the UK economy, forecasting inflation could come down to 2% within months. It's held interest rates at 5.25% again. In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed down 8 points at 76.22. The pound buys $1.27 and €1.17. LBC weather, light rain tonight for northwest Scotland and some parts of Northern Ireland. Clear for central and southeast England and a low of 3 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Daryl Jackson.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Iain Dale.
It's 9 on LBC. Welcome to the show. If you've just joined us, you missed a